Hello again, everyone. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the P5.js programming language and JavaScript. Last time, we talked about some of the basics of colors. And if you remember, we said that we can control the background of our drawing numbers. If we gave it one number, it's a grayscale color, so black to white and somewhere in between. Or if we give it three numbers, which is RGB, we could potentially pick any color in the options of possible colors, and we mentioned a color picker that allows us to pick any color we like and get the RGB values, three numbers that tell us what color we want our background to be. In my case, I'm going to make my background a light color, so I'm going to do maybe 240, which is very, very light. As a background, I'm going to make my background larger. The create canvas tells us how wide and then how tall our canvas can be. So there it is. And the next step is what we're going to talk about is how to draw lines, right? Because before we can draw anything, often lines are relatively easy to work with. We do require a little bit of information to understand how lines are going to be placed on our canvas. And some of it is pretty obvious, and I think because we've all done a good amount of math in our lives, it's relatively easy to kind of have a sense of it. But there is a big difference, one distinction, particularly when it comes to drawing on screen, versus drawing what you do in math. Maybe if you're drawing lines or triangles or shapes in math, there's one distinction that's going to be not the norms that we need to talk about. So first things first, again, establishing that this first number is how wide our canvas is, and then the second number is how tall it is. Every single pixel, every single spot on this canvas has two numbers associated with it. This is the X and Y coordinate. X is going to be the horizontal coordinate, so if this is 600, the middle would be 300, and that would be somewhere up here. That's going from left to right, is what works. 0 is the left side. 600 is the right side. So if I were to put a number around here, it's going to be closer to 600 than it is to 0. In a similar fashion, 600 for the height is also how long this line is going to be to draw our canvas. But now the distinction from our math is typically math, if we do positive numbers, we go upwards in our graph. We were to draw a graph in math, a line in math, we'd say, oh, positive y is upward and downward is negative y. Likewise, positive x is to the right, and this is what's happening here, and negative x is to the left. Unfortunately, in our system here, the positive numbers for y are actually downward, and this is mainly because we typically consider the top left of our screen the starting part of our entire program. So in our canvas, right here is 0, 0, that top left corner. This top right corner, the x is 600, but the y, since it's at the top, is still 0. So we have to always be aware of like where in our canvas is our pixel that we're going to draw. And then when we draw our lines, if we know where the points of the line are, we can essentially have a good estimate as to where it's going to show up. So we're going to have to deal with that as we draw our lines. The second half of a line, besides its placement, is going to be its color. The default color for lines is going to be black, but we're going to have the ability to change it. So before we change it, I'm going to first draw a simple black line, and then we're going to change the color of the line and maybe change a few other things to see how this works. So we have our background, and I'm going to do this in draw because remember, setup happens one time, draw happens many times. So generally speaking, we want most of the drawing commands that we write to appear in the draw again and again, and so they should appear on screen. So here we are, we have our background, and the command we're going to use, and I'm going to say the line command allows us to draw, and many of these names are very obvious, so that's convenient, lines, right? So I guess that's a kind of silly statement to say, but it's good to have. So the line command is a little bit different than these because it requires more information. And in fact, I have it already open, but we can always go to the reference section and look up different commands. And you can see I looked up the line command, and it gives us a great example and tells us, draws a line, a direct path between 2 points to the screen. And it gives us a bunch of extra information. We don't necessarily need all of that just yet, but we can see here's the one we're going to be using. It says, well, if you tell me the x and y coordinate of the first point, and you tell me the x and y coordinate of the second point, I will draw a line between those 2 points. And so that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to make the line show up anywhere. I'll pick any numbers, and then we can think about them and talk about what those numbers are. So I'm going to say line, and notice the command, there it is. In our parentheses of our command, we're going to say, well, the first number, I'm going to go ahead and put it at, let's say, 50. That's the x. The y, I'm going to put at about 150. Another comma, and now the x of the second point, so I'll make this one at 300, and then the y will be at, let's say, 250. And there it is. And so again, I didn't say anything about the color, so we'll see in a moment that the color will be black by default. When I draw it, so we can see a line is now on screen. So what happens is the program runs its commands in order, right? It's not smart enough to know, oh, I can skip around. It does first thing, second thing, third thing in order. So it draws the background. So you can imagine we painted our giant canvas with this gray color, and then we drew a line right over it. We painted, we stroked a line with our paintbrush over our gray background. And you can see there it is. So thinking about this, our first coordinate is 50, 150. Remember, it's x, then y, then x, then y. So the first x is 50. So if we think about it, if the left is 0, we went about 50 pixels in, and that's right there. The y is 150. If the top is 0, we went about 150 in, and there it is. So we went 50 to the right, and we went 150 down, and that gives us this first point right here. The next one is 300x. So from the left, we went about 300 pixels in. And then from the y, 250 pixels down. So this is 300 and then 250. And you think about it, it makes sense. If this one starts at 50 and this one's at 300, that means we went more right. Right? So we went from 50 to 250. That's a difference of about 250 pixels. Similarly, if we started at 150 right here and we went to 250, we went about 100 pixels down, and that's this one. And again, the command, what it does for us, it says, okay, well, I'll connect those 2 points with that line. And there it is. And we can see this line happens. Let's try drawing another line, but let's change the color. So if we want to change a line color, we have another command to learn. And again, one of the challenges of practicing programming is having to know so many details. Thankfully, nowadays, most stuff is online, so you don't have to memorize every little detail. It's good to kind of have some stuff in your mind, but if you have to look it up, it's not really a problem. And so the command we're going to be using is called stroke. So I'm going to say we can change line colors using the stroke command. And so the stroke command, and so I'll write how it looks, is you give it either 1 or 3 numbers. In fact, it's basically like background. The only difference is that it affects the line instead of the background. So we can say R, G, B, or if we give it 1 number, it would be the grayscale. So you can give it those 3 numbers. Let's go ahead and say stroke. And then let's do a, I don't know, let's use our color picker. I have a color picker open. Let's try something like an aqua looking line. Our background's light, so maybe that won't look good. So maybe I'll do a little bit. Let's try this color. Not aqua, it's a bluish color. So 14, 132, 156. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to come back to our editor. I'm going to paste in those 3 numbers. So there it is, my blue line. So now the trick here is, in order for the line to show up as that color, the stroke command must be called before the line command. So this line is black because the default is black and we didn't change anything. So this one will show up again black. But if we call stroke now, afterwards, this one is unaffected, but anything after the stroke command will then be affected. So if I draw another line here, and I say, okay, let's do a line. And in fact, I want to make a horizontal line somewhere around down here. So horizontal, if you think about lines in a graph kind of layout, what makes it horizontal is that the y value doesn't change, right? So if the y's are the same, then the line goes straight across left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and put this maybe like at 450 is my x. Oh, sorry, no, the x I'm going to start on the left side, so it'll be much smaller. Let's try it at 50 as well, like the last one. Our y will be 450, so it'll be much, much lower, so 450 pixels down. Our next x is going to be much further to the right. So if this is 50, let's go almost all the way to the end, so let's go to 550. And then the y will stay the same because it's a horizontal line, so 450. Right, and there's our command. I forgot to mention, I realized I forgot to do this, so it's important that we do this now, is at the end of all of our commands, generally speaking, we should put semicolons. It's kind of like a period in English, right? You end a sentence or a statement with a period or an exclamation point. And in a similar fashion for our JavaScript code, we should be putting semicolons. And if you don't put it, it sometimes works, but it could also cause problems, so it's much better that we practice putting our semicolons at the end. I also say that all this extra enters, the spaces I'm putting between lines, is not strictly necessary. It's helpful, it makes it easier to read, but it's not required. So for example, I might like these stay together. It's kind of like paragraphs in English, right? Paragraphs are things that are grouped together to give the idea of a relationship between that text. And another paragraph is maybe a small separation. So in a similar fashion, we can do the same here. So if I run this, notice something went wrong, right? I was saying that this first line would stay black, but it didn't. It's suddenly the same color as the bottom one. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that happening? And the answer is because this draw command happens 60 times per second, I mean, it repeats itself. Again, this is not like drawing one painting. It's drawing 60 paintings a second. So that's a lot of paintings. And the idea is that what it does is it wipes out everything. And unfortunately, it kind of also has a memory. Our program kind of remembers things as it's running and drawing our pictures. And so once we call stroke, the last color that you tell it to be marking is essentially the next color used for everything else. So we start off, the default is black. We draw a black line. We change our color to this blue. We draw a blue line. And then we come back around and our background wipes out everything. So now we have a giant gray slate again. But the color that we marked with stroke is still remembered. So the next line that it draws on the new painting is the old color. It's kind of like a paintbrush. You had the black paint on your paintbrush. You drew the first line. You cleaned your paintbrush. You put the blue on it. You drew the blue line. But then instead, when we came back around to our new canvas, instead of cleaning the brush again, we left the blue on it. So the next lines are blue again and again. So now what this tells us, the bottom line, is that if you're going to draw lines, generally speaking, do not trust the default colors to stick around. Make the color clear every time you draw something. So I'm going to have to do another stroke before this line, particularly if I want them to be different colors. So I'm going to say stroke, and I want it to be black. So I'm going to be lazy or strategically lazy, and I'm going to pick the single number that represents black, which is 0. Remember, if you give it one number, it's grayscale, 0 to 255. 0 is the darkest it can be, which is black. If I run it again, line, right? And there it is. So let's do one more line and one more command. So first things first, we said we have to pick a color. I'm going to pick a different color. Let's try something like a light green. Let's do like a very close to almost bright green. It's almost a lime green. I'm going to pick those 4 numbers, 44, 240, and 10. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come here. I'm going to say stroke. So I'm going to pick a new color, that greenish color, and I'm going to draw a line. This time I want a vertical line. I want the line to be over here somewhere. So top, down, straight line, vertical. Remember, X is left and right, Y is up and down. The bigger the Y, the lower it is. The bigger the X, the more to the right it is. So if I want it to be somewhere over here, my X's should be pretty big. And because it's a vertical line straight down, the X's do not change, right? You, I'm sure, have seen this in math, where if you don't change your X when you draw a line, when you're graphing, it stays vertical. So let's go ahead and put 500 for our X. Our Y, we're going to start up here, so not at 0, which is the top, but somewhere a little bit lower, so maybe like 50. Our X stays the same, because we're not changing angles, we're not working straight down vertically. And our other Y, if we go down here, if I go past 450, past 450, I think I'm going to end up crossing this line. So I don't want to do that just yet, so I'm going to make a small number. Let's do 400. So from 550, which is right here, to 500 and 400, which is somewhere like here, or around here. So let's try this and see what this looks like. Do now, which is new, is we could also change the thickness of the line, because these are all pretty thin lines, but you can imagine situations where you want a much thicker line. How can we do that? One more command. We will say, and I'll put notes here, we can change the thickness of a line using the stroke weight command. And you think about it, a lot of these words are very much like art, right? You stroke your paintbrush to put paint on a canvas. And so the stroke weight is like how much pressure you put it. You can imagine if you're using a brush and you're putting lightly, your lines are going to be thin. But if you push the brush into the canvas, you're going to get a lot thicker of a line. And it's the same as here. We'll say stroke weight is one number. And it's basically how thick you want it in pixels. So 1 pixel, I think, is the default. And we can change the number to be much bigger. So I'm going to do this. And just like stroke, and we're going to see it. Now, this is where the things start to get kind of a little bit, you have to kind of pay attention. Once you change the stroke weight, the next time around, every stroke weight will be the same. So we have to, now, if I use it once, I got to use it everywhere. So let's try this to prove my point and then correct it after the fact. So stroke weight. And I'm going to go ahead and put 5. And there's my semicolon. I keep forgetting my semicolons. Those are important to have. I'm going to run my code. but all of them are thicker because the way it works, and again, this is maybe in my analogy of a human painter breaking down, but you can imagine like once the painter decided to push a certain hardness, pressure onto the canvas, he doesn't ever change that. So they have to go out of their way to lighten their pressure again to make it thinner. So we have to be kind of explicit. Once you start using stroke weight, you pretty much have to use it for every different drawing you make, because otherwise they're going to kind of get blended together. So I'm going to do stroke weight here as well of 1, which is I think the default. So we'll just be very simple with this. We'll say stroke weight of 1. And I'll also point out the order does not matter. Whether you do, it matters for the line command, but for stroke and stroke weight, whether you pick the color first and then the thickness, or the thickness and the color is irrelevant. What matters is they have to happen before you draw the line with the line command. So if I run it now, originally thin 1 pixel, and then a thickness of 5, and then down straight green. So there we have our lines. So with this, you can imagine you could come up with all kinds of things. You can get lines. And so I'm not going to do it, so I'll leave it to you to practice and consider this, and your activity will also be related to this. Could you draw a horizontal line from the top left to the bottom right? Could you draw a horizontal line from the top right to the bottom left? Could you maybe stack up a bunch of different lines? Right? Think about what you could do to make this happen. And so the idea is that if you can practice your positioning, if you can do that, then you can draw lines almost in any direction, and you can make angled lines and things like that pretty easily by playing around with the line command. So we'll stop here and we'll continue with some other shapes in our next video. I'll see you in that next video.